It started with a simple job, a woman taking care of an elderly patient in a billionaire's mansion. But when she entered his office and saw that old portrait on the wall, she realized she was standing before the boy she thought she had lost forever. The morning in Palo Alto began with the cold gleam of steel and glass. The Whitmore mansion stood as a monument to the impossible, a modern fortress of straight lines and floor-to-ceiling windows that reflected the California sky like perfect mirrors. Within those impeccable walls, Edward Whitmore, at 37, had already achieved more than most people would dream of in a lifetime. CEO of Whitmore Innovations, his artificial intelligence company had revolutionized the healthcare industry, making him a billionaire before 30. Forbes and Fortune magazines called him the adopted prodigy. The perfect American dream story. An orphanage boy transformed into a technology titan. The narrative that sold magazines and inspired motivational speeches. But on that September morning, as Edward watched his espresso cup cool on the Italian marble countertop, he felt the suffocating weight of an emptiness that all that success couldn't fill. The mansion had 12 bedrooms. He slept in only one. He had a garage with 7 luxury cars. He always drove the same black Tesla. There was a private cinema room that was never used, an untouched infinity pool, and a garden designed by award-winning landscape architects that he never set foot in. Mr. Whitmore, the meeting with the Japanese investors has been rescheduled for 3. Jennifer, his executive assistant, echoed over the wall-mounted intercom. Confirmed, Edward replied on autopilot without taking his eyes off the panoramic window overlooking the valley. He was 37, but sometimes he felt like he had lived 100. Or maybe like he had never really lived at all. There was an invisible dividing line in his existence, a before and an after as sharp as a scar. Before 10, he was Leo, a thin, scared boy with eyes too big for his face who drew castles on scraps of recycled paper at St. Mary's orphanage. After 10, he became Edward Whitmore, the adopted son of Richard and Margaret Whitmore, heir to a legacy of privilege he never asked for, but learned to wear like armor. The problem is, armor is cold and heavy, and sometimes, late at night, when the silence in the mansion became deafening, Edward could still hear the echo of a child's voice calling his real name. "Leo! Leo! Wake up! Monsters aren't real, I promise." He shook his head, pushing the memory away as he always did. Memories were dangerous luxuries for men who had built empires on fragile foundations. Richard Whitmore, his adoptive father, a deceased investment magnate of 5 years, had taught him that. The past is dead weight, Edward. Successful men only look forward. Edward had followed that advice religiously. He destroyed every orphanage record he could find, except for one. A single oil portrait painted by his adoptive mother, Margaret, himself at 7, holding a drawing of a castle, with that shy, scared smile of someone who didn't yet know he would be rescued from poverty. Margaret insisted on painting that portrait when he was 15, using a faded photo from the adoption agency as a reference. "So, you never forget where you came from, dear," she had said with that maternal tone that always disarmed him. Now, at 70, Margaret was battling early-onset dementia in a medical suite on the 2nd floor of the mansion, where 24-hour nurses monitored her slow, cruel decline. Edward climbed the stairs, his footsteps echoing on the cold marble. He needed to check the schedule for the new caregiver starting today, the 4th in 6 months. The others couldn't handle the intensity of Margaret during her confused episodes when she would shout for people who no longer existed or confuse Edward with Richard. "Jennifer, did you confirm the arrival of the new home health aide?" he asked on his cell phone as he walked down the hallway lined with expensive, soulless contemporary art. "Yes, sir. Clara Martinez, 37 years old, 15 years of experience, impeccable references. She arrives at 9 o'clock. Edward checked his watch. 8:40. He had exactly 20 minutes before another stranger entered his perfectly controlled and emotionally sterile life. 20 minutes before everything he had built on the ashes of who he used to be began to crack. revealing the fragile foundations of a boy named Leo, who never truly stopped searching for someone who loved him when he had nothing to offer but crude drawings of castles that existed only in his desperate imagination. But Edward Whitmore didn't know this yet. He didn't know that at 9:12 that September morning, the past he had so meticulously buried would finally catch up to him, brought by the trembling hands of a woman who never forgot him. Clara Martinez parked her 2008 Honda Civic, with the dented passenger side panel and the bumper patched with duct tape, in the service parking area of the Whitmore mansion, where a discreet sign read, "Service Entrance." She turned off the engine and closed her eyes for a moment, taking a deep breath, trying to calm the whirlwind of anxiety that had consumed her since she woke up at 5 in the morning. 37 years old. 15 of them dedicated to caring for people in the most vulnerable phases of life. Yet, this morning, her hands trembled on the steering wheel as if it were her first day on the job. But it wasn't fear of the work. It was fear of failing. Again. In the back seat, carefully folded inside a plastic grocery bag, was her freshly washed navy blue uniform. In the glove compartment, a white envelope containing the hospital letter, the third collection notice, this time on red paper, the kind that meant last chance before legal action. $43,000. That was the number that chased her in every thought, every breath. The cost of the heart surgery that Marcus, her 8-year-old son, desperately needed. "You can do it, Mommy. You always do." Marcus's high-pitched, optimistic voice echoed in her memory from that morning, when she dropped him off at the neighbor's house before heading to work. That boy had more courage in his little finger than she had in her whole body. He was born with a congenital heart defect, ventricular septal defect, the doctors called it, and since then her life had been an endless sequence of appointments, exams, worries, and bills that accumulated like avalanches. Clara opened the car door, the fresh September air hitting her face. The Whitmore mansion rose before her like something out of an architectural magazine. All glass, steel, and exposed concrete, with gardens that looked like they had been organized with a ruler and compass. It was a world so distant from her one-bedroom apartment in San Jose, where the heater broke down every winter and the faucet dripped an irritating symphony every night. "Focus, Clara. You need this job," she murmured to herself, adjusting the purse on her shoulder, a worn imitation leather bag she'd had since community college. $5,000 a month. That was the salary. 3 times what she made at her last job. In a year, she could pay for Marcus's surgery, settle the overdue debts, maybe even rent a better apartment in a neighborhood where she didn't have to check the locks 3 times before sleeping. She rang the service entrance bell. An efficient female voice answered through the intercom. "Miss Martinez?" "Yes, it's me, Clara Martinez, the new home health aide. Come in, please. First door on the right." The electronic lock clicked, and Clara entered a hallway with porcelain tile flooring that reflected the built-in lights in the ceiling like a mirror. Everything in there smelled of money, that kind of impeccable cleanliness that was only possible when you could afford people to remove even the memories of dust. An elegant woman of about 50, blonde hair pulled back in a perfect bun, a gray Armani suit, and heels that clicked with authority, extended her hand. "Jennifer Crawford, Mr. Whitmore's executive assistant. Welcome." Clara shook her hand, feeling the difference between Jennifer's impeccable manicure and her own short, unpolished nails. Hands of someone who works, not someone who manages. "I'll take you to meet Mrs. Margaret Whitmore," Jennifer said, already walking toward the private elevator. "Some important warnings. Mrs. Whitmore has rapid onset early dementia. Some days she is lucid, others she doesn't recognize her own son. She can become agitated, confused, sometimes aggressive. Do you have experience with Alzheimer's patients?" "Yes, I've worked with 7 patients in the same condition over the last 5 years," Clara replied, her professional voice masking the exhaustion she carried in her bones. "Excellent. Mr. Whitmore is extremely particular about his mother's care. He expects excellence." Nothing less than that. Jennifer stared at her with an intensity that was half warning, half test. The last 4 caregivers didn't last more than 2 months. Clara swallowed hard but held her gaze steady. "I don't give up easily, Miss Crawford." A minimal smile appeared on Jennifer's lips. Approval or skepticism, Clara couldn't decipher. The elevator opened on the 2nd floor, revealing another corridor of quiet luxury, but this time with a more human touch. Framed photographs on the walls, fresh flowers in crystal vases, a softer, welcoming light. Mrs. Whitmore's suite is the last door. You will have full access to this area. Mr. Whitmore's office is on the 1st floor, west wing. That area is strictly private unless he requests your presence. Understood? Perfectly. Jennifer paused at the suite door, her hand on the knob, but turned before opening it. "One last thing, Miss Martinez. Mr. Whitmore doesn't like emotional involvement. Keep things professional. No personal questions, no curiosity about the family. Do your job, and you'll get along fine." Clara nodded, but inside, a familiar sadness squeezed her. This was the life of the invisible, of people like her, who entered the homes of the rich to clean up the mess, care for the sick, raise the children, but always with the clear reminder that they were replaceable pieces in a machine that would never stop to ask their real names. "Don't worry, I understand my place," Clara said, and there was a layer of pain in those words that Jennifer didn't perceive. The door opened, revealing a suite bathed in natural light, where a white-haired lady was sitting in a blue velvet armchair, looking out the window with a distant expression, as if searching for something that existed only in her fragmented memory. Clara entered, professional and invisible, unaware that in a few hours she would cease to be just another anonymous employee. Unaware that the mansion she had just entered held a secret buried 30 years ago. A secret painted in oil and framed in gold, silently waiting in the forbidden office on the 1st floor, about to explode like a bomb of truths that all the money in the world could neither buy nor erase. 3 days. Clara had managed to survive 3 full days in the Whitmore mansion without making any fatal mistakes. 3 days caring for Margaret, a woman who alternated between moments of moving sweetness and episodes of devastating confusion, calling Clara Elizabeth, Sarah, or simply the girl. But on that Thursday morning, everything would change. Margaret had had an especially difficult night, waking up at 3 in the morning screaming about a fire that never existed, convinced she needed to save the boy. It took Clara 2 hours to calm her, singing soft songs and holding her wrinkled hand until the terror in the faded blue eyes finally dissolved into exhaustion. By 9 in the morning, Margaret was finally sleeping deeply, her chest rising and falling at a peaceful rhythm for the first time in hours. Clara checked the vitals monitor. Everything stable. She had perhaps 30 minutes before the morning shift nurse arrived for the bath and medication. "I need to get the extra medicine from the office," Clara murmured to herself, remembering that Jennifer had mentioned the emergency lorazepam stock was locked in a specific cabinet on the 1st floor. She descended the marble staircase, her rubber-soled sneakers making an almost inaudible sound. The mansion was in its characteristic morning silence. Edward had already left for a meeting in San Francisco. The cleaning crew wouldn't arrive until 10, and Jennifer was somewhere managing the invisible empire of appointments and business. Clara followed the West Wing corridor, counting doors as Jennifer had instructed. 3rd door on the left, steel cabinet next to the bookshelf. She turned the knob, unlocked, thank goodness, and stepped inside. And that's when the world stopped. Edward Whitmore's office was a declaration of contained power. Dark mahogany desk, Italian leather executive chair, 3 computer monitors in perfect arrangement, shelves filled with books on artificial intelligence, business, and biographies of industry titans. But none of it registered in Clara's mind. Because there, on the main wall, illuminated by a strategically positioned spotlight, was an oil portrait inside an elaborate golden frame. A boy, approximately 7 years old, seated on a wooden stool, dark brown hair naturally disheveled, deep, immense brown eyes looking directly at the observer with a mixture of shyness and hope. In his small hands he held a drawing, a crude castle made with crayon, with disproportionate towers and a flag on top. Clara felt her legs fail her. The tray she was carrying with the glass of water slipped from her hands, hitting the hardwood floor with a crash that echoed through the room. Water splashed in all directions, but she didn't move. She couldn't. Her eyes were glued to that face. No, it can't be. Her voice came out as a strangled whisper, the words struggling to take shape through the shockwave that went through her. She took 2 shaky steps toward the portrait, her hands instinctively rising as if she wanted to touch it, to verify it was real, that it wasn't some cruel trick of her exhausted mind. Tears began to burn her eyes before she even fully understood what she was seeing. Those eyes, that expression, the way the corner of his mouth curved slightly upward, half smile, half fear, the tiny scar on his left eyebrow, so small that only someone who knew him intimately would notice. "My God!" Clara gasped, and then something inside her broke like an ancient dam finally giving way to decades of pressure. "My God! This boy lived with me in the orphanage." The words came out as a choked, raw scream from the deepest part of her soul. Her legs finally gave out, and she fell to her knees on the wet floor, her hands covering her mouth as violent sobs shook her entire body. St. Mary's, 1995. The smell of cheap disinfectant and watery soup. The freezing dormitory with rusty iron beds lined up like soldiers. And a little boy, 4 years old, newly arrived, huddled in a corner, clutching a thin, torn blanket, his enormous eyes filled with silent tears. "Hey, little one, what's your name?" Clara, with her 7 years of authority, had knelt down in front of him. "Leo," he had whispered, his voice so low she had to lean in to hear. "Leo, I like that name. I'm Clara. And you know what? You don't have to be afraid. I'll take care of you, okay?" And she did. For 3 precious years. She shared her food when Leo was hungry. She defended him from the bigger boys who mocked him for being small and quiet. She dried his tears when he cried in the dark, scared by the thunder that shook the old orphanage windows. She sat next to him on the cold floor as he drew those endless castles on scraps of recycled paper, each tower representing a different room in the imaginary house where they would live when we're big. She loved him like an older sister, like a mother, like the only family either of them had in that place forgotten by God and men. Until that day in September 1998. The day, a rich couple, the man in an expensive suit, the woman in perfume that smelled of costly flowers, showed up and chose Leo. Only Leo. Not Clara. Never Clara. No one ever wanted the older girls, the ones who were already troubled, difficult, damaged. "Clara! Clara! I don't want to go! Clara!" Leo had screamed, his small arms outstretched toward her as the man in the suit carried him out. Clara tried to run after him, but Mrs. Henderson, the icy supervisor, held her back. "Stop the drama, girl. He's going to have a better life. Be grateful for him." But how could she be grateful when her heart was being ripped from her chest? How could she be grateful when the only person who made her feel she was worth anything was being taken away? That was the last time Clara saw Leo. Until now, Leo. Clara whispered to the portrait through the tears that wouldn't stop falling. "Leo, you're here. You've always been here. My God, you became all this." She stood up with difficulty, her legs still trembling, and approached the portrait as if it were something sacred. Her fingers touched the frame's glass, tracing the outline of the painted face with a reverent delicacy, as if she could reach across time and touch the boy she loved and lost. "You grew up," she cried softly. "You grew up and became someone important. You made it. My little Leo made it." And then the guilt hit her like a punch to the stomach. Why did I never look for him? Why did I just accept that he was gone forever? Why was I such a coward? Clara didn't know how long she stayed there. kneeling on the floor of that forbidden office, staring at the ghost of her past framed in gold. She didn't hear the front door open. She didn't hear the decisive footsteps in the marble corridor. She heard nothing but the roar of her own broken heart finally finding the missing pieces. Until a male voice, cold and sharp as broken glass, cut through the silence behind her. "What the hell are you doing in my office?" Clara froze. Slowly, very slowly, she turned, still kneeling on the wet floor, her face drenched in tears, to face the man standing in the doorway. Edward Whitmore, 37 years old. Dark gray Tom Ford suit, hard brown eyes fixed on her with fury and suspicion. The older, angular, masculine face, but with the same immense eyes, the same tiny scar on his eyebrow. Leo. Her little champion, and he had no idea who she was. Clara couldn't speak. The words died in her throat, choked by the storm of emotions tearing her apart inside. There he was, the boy she rocked during nightmares, the boy she protected from bullies, the boy who called her "my Clara," as if she were the most precious thing in the world. Now, a man, a stranger in a $3,000 suit who looked at her as if she were an intruder. "I asked what you're doing here," Edward repeated, his voice dropping an octave, dangerous. He took 2 steps into the office, closing the door behind him with a definitive click. "This area is strictly off-limits to staff. Jennifer made that very clear." Clara tried to stand up, but her legs betrayed her again. She braced herself on the edge of the mahogany desk, her fingers white from gripping so hard, desperately trying to find her professional voice, the mask she wore to survive in the world of the wealthy. I am so sorry, Mr. Whitmore. I came to get emergency medication for your mother. She had a difficult night, and I needed the extra lorazepam that's in the cabinet." Her voice failed as her eyes involuntarily returned to the portrait. Edward followed her gaze. His expression hardened even more, if that was possible. "And that justifies you kneeling on my office floor, crying in front of a private portrait?" "No, I didn't. Clara furiously wiped her face with her hands, smudging the cheap makeup she wore. She needed to get out of there, needed to breathe, needed to think. "I'm sorry, it was inappropriate. I will." "You will stay exactly where you are." Edward cut her off, crossing his arms over his chest. There was something in his eyes now, not just anger, but cautious curiosity, like a cat watching something it can't categorize. "And you will explain to me why you are having an emotional breakdown looking at a portrait of me when I was 7. Clara's heart hammered so hard she could hear it in her ears. Tell him the truth. But the words were so big, so impossible. How do you tell someone, "I knew you when we were kids, and you were my favorite person in the whole world"? How do you explain 3 decades of emptiness, of searching for that face in crowds, of waking up in the middle of the night still hearing his scream calling her name? Clara took a deep breath, forcing herself to look directly into his eyes. Those same brown eyes that used to look at her with absolute trust. "I knew you. Before. When you were little." Edward didn't move, but something shifted in his expression. A tension, as if every muscle in his body had prepared for impact. "Explain." "St. Mary's," Clara whispered, and it was like opening an old wound that never truly healed. "St. Mary's orphanage in Oakland. I lived there, from 1993 to 2006. And you arrived in 1995. You were 4 years old, so small, so scared." Edward's mask wavered for a fraction of a second, a flash of something that could be recognition or fear, or perhaps just shock. But then he rebuilt it, even stronger. "Many children went through that place. Why do you think—" "Your name was Leo," Clara interrupted him, her voice gaining strength for the first time. "You didn't like being called anything but Leo. You had constant nightmares. Monsters under the bed, monsters in the closet, monsters in the shadows. And every night I would go to your bed and say, 'The monsters aren't real, Leo. And if they were, I would fight them for you. and you always replied, "You're my champion, Clara." Edward froze completely. The color drained from his face. "My little champion," Clara continued, the tears returning, but this time she didn't try to stop them. "That's what you called me, your little champion, because I was only 3 years older, but to you, I was big enough to keep the monsters away." "Stop," Edward said, but his voice came out rough, broken at the edges. "Stop now." But Clara couldn't stop. 30 years of silence were gushing out like water from a burst dam. "You drew castles. Every day, on any scrap of paper you could find. Wrapping paper, margins of old books, napkins from the cafeteria, always castles. And you said that one day when you were big, you would live in a real castle. And I would always laugh and say, 'And will I live with you?' And you always answered, 'Of course, you're my family.'" "I said stop," Edward roared, but there was something cracking in his voice, something that wasn't rage, but pure panic. Clara took a step toward him, her hands outstretched as if she could reach across the abyss of 3 decades. "You had a scar on your right knee, crescent moon shaped. You fell off the rusty swing set on the orphanage playground when you were 5. It needed 4 stitches. You squeezed my hand so hard at the hospital that it left nail marks, and you didn't cry. Not a single tear. You were so brave." Edward recoiled, as if she had physically struck him. His hand instinctively went to his right knee, over his expensive suit pants. He knew the scar was there. He could feel it, a crescent-shaped mark that no doctor ever really managed to explain because he never told anyone how it happened. How do you know that?" he whispered, and for the first time, the mask fell completely. For the first time, Clara saw the boy beneath the billionaire. Scared, confused, lost. "Because I was there," Clara said gently, as if she were talking to 7-year-old Leo and not 37-year-old Edward. "I was there holding your hand. I was there drying your tears. I was there every time you were scared, every time you were hungry, every time you needed someone. I was there, Leo. I was always there." "Don't call me that," Edward retorted, but there was zero conviction in his voice. "That name, I haven't used that name for 27 years, Clara completed softly. "Since the Whitmores adopted you when you were 10, since you became Edward. But before that, you were Leo, and you were mine." The silence that followed was thick, suffocating. Edward looked at her as if seeing a ghost, and maybe he was. A ghost of a past he had worked so hard to bury, to overcome, to forget. I don't remember you," he finally said. But it was a lie, and they both knew it. Because his eyes were saying the opposite. His eyes were scanning her face, searching, digging through the layers of age and tiredness, looking for the 7-year-old girl who used to smile at him as if he were precious. "You remember," Clara said with absolute conviction. "Maybe not consciously. Maybe you buried it so deep you convinced yourself it was forgetfulness. But somewhere, Leo, you remember. You have to remember." Edward shook his head, backing up until his back hit the door. This is crazy. You probably researched my history, found out I was adopted from an orphanage, made up this elaborate story to—" "You were terrified of thunder," Clara cut him off, each word a sure arrow. "When it rained, you would crawl under my bed, not yours, mine, and huddle there until the storm passed. And I would put my hand down, over the edge of the mattress, and you would hold my fingers until you fell asleep." Edward closed his eyes. A single tear, just one, escaped the left corner and slowly traced a path down his face. "And when you were adopted," Clara continued, her own voice breaking, "you screamed my name. You screamed, 'Clara, Clara,' as the man in the suit carried you out. And I tried to run after you, but Mrs. Henderson held me back, and you looked back one last time before getting into the car. And I saw your mouth form the words, even though I couldn't hear them. 'I'll come back, I promise.'" Edward opened his eyes. They were red, shining with unshed tears. "I didn't come back," he whispered, and there was a guilt so profound in those words that Clara felt her heart break again. You were a child, Leo. You had no choice. Edward, he corrected automatically but without force. My name is Edward now. All right, Clara agreed gently. Edward, but 30 years ago, you were Leo, and I was your Clara, and we were family, the only family we had. Edward slid slowly down the door until he was sitting on the floor, knees bent, head in his hands. The billionaire CEO, reduced to a small boy once again, crushed by the weight of memories he had locked away in boxes deep in his mind. Clara approached slowly, carefully, and sat down on the floor next to him, maintaining a respectful distance but close enough for him to know she was there. I didn't want to remember, Edward finally said, his voice muffled by his hands. Remembering hurts too much. That place, those memories, they suffocated me, so I locked them away. All of them, including me, Clara said, and it wasn't an accusation, just a sad statement. Including you, he admitted, finally lowering his hands and looking at her. Really looking, seeing not just the employee but the girl she had been. But you're right, I remember. Not everything, but fragments, a smile, a singing voice, small hands holding mine, and a name, Clara. Always Clara. They sat there on the floor of the most expensive office in California, two orphans who found and lost each other, and now, against all impossible odds, found each other again. But the story was just beginning, because memories were only the first step. Now came the questions, the proof, the truths that needed to be unearthed, and Edward Whitmore was not ready for what came next. Edward did not return to the office for the rest of the day. He simply stood up from the floor, muttered something about unavoidable meetings, and disappeared out the door, leaving Clara alone with the portrait and the heavy silence of unprocessed revelations. She returned to caring for Margaret as if nothing had happened, but her hands trembled while checking the blood pressure, and her mind was miles away, stuck in 1998, the moment the boy she loved disappeared through the orphanage door. 3 days passed. 3 days of deafening silence. Edward avoided the second floor when Clara was there, leaving early, returning late, communicating only through Jennifer with cold, professional instructions about Margaret's care. Clara felt the familiar fear grow in her chest, the fear of having done something wrong, of crossing boundaries, of being about to lose another job, $43,000, Marcus's surgery, the red envelope that was still in her car's glove compartment like a death sentence. But on the morning of the 4th day, everything changed. Clara was in Margaret's room, helping her eat breakfast, small pieces of toast with jam that the lady ate with a confused slowness, as if she had forgotten how to chew, when she heard footsteps in the corridor. Steps she had already learned to recognize. Decisive. Measured. Edward. He appeared in the doorway, still in a suit, this time navy blue with a silver tie, but there was something different about his face. The armor was cracked. His eyes had dark circles underneath, as if he hadn't slept properly in days. "Miss Martinez," he said formally, but his voice was rough. "I need to speak with you. In my office. Now." Clara's heart sank. Here it comes, the firing. The cold letter of recommendation. The final check. "Yes, Mr. Whitmore," she replied professionally, putting Margaret's plate aside and drying her hands. Jennifer instantly appeared to take over Margaret's care, and Clara followed Edward down the corridor, down the stairs to the office where everything had begun. He closed the door behind them, not with anger, but carefully, as if sealing something precious. Then he turned to face her, and Clara saw something in his eyes that disarmed her completely. Vulnerability. "I hired 3 private investigators," Edward began without preamble, his hands in his pockets as if he didn't know what to do with them. "Over the last 3 days, the best on the West Coast, to verify your story." Clara felt her blood run cold. And everything you said is true. he continued, his voice getting weaker with every word. Clara Martinez, born March 2, 1988. Entered the foster care system at age 5 when her mother died of an overdose. Lived at St. Mary's in Oakland from 1993 to 2006. Never adopted. Left at age 18 with a backpack and $50. Worked 3 jobs simultaneously to pay for community college. Certified as a home health aide in 2010. Had a son, Marcus, in 2017. Single. No criminal record. Impeccable references from all previous employers. He pulled a thick manila envelope from the desk and held it between them as evidence. I have your entire life documented here. And nowhere, Clara, is there any indication that you are lying or trying to take advantage of me. Clara didn't know whether to feel relieved or violated by the invasion of privacy. You needed proof. I needed sanity, Edward corrected, throwing the envelope back onto the desk harder than necessary. Because if everything you said is real, then that means I have spent 30 years trying to forget the only person who truly cared about me when I had nothing, and that makes me a coward. No, Clara said immediately, taking a step toward him. No, Leo. Edward, you are not a coward. You were a traumatized child who did what you needed to survive. There is no shame in that. Edward laughed, a bitter, joyless sound. Survive? That's an interesting word. I survived. More than that. I thrived. I became exactly what the Whitmores wanted. The perfect adopted son, the prodigy CEO, the philanthropic billionaire. But do you want to know the pathetic truth? He finally looked directly into her eyes. I haven't slept properly in 27 years. Every night when it starts to rain, I still feel that irrational fear. And sometimes, in the middle of the night, I wake up and for a second, just 1 second, I'm still in that iron bed at St. Mary's. And I look for me, Clara completed softly, feeling tears sting her eyes again. Edward closed his eyes, pinching the bridge of his nose as if trying to hold back some emotion that threatened to overflow. When he spoke again, his voice was barely audible. For the last 3 days, I've been dreaming, things I swore I had forgotten. A girl with dark hair tied in uneven braids, a smile that made me feel safe, small hands teaching me to tie my shoes because no one else had the patience, a voice saying. He stopped, unable to continue. Clara took another step, now less than a meter from him. My little champion, she whispered. And then it happened. Edward Whitmore's last defense, meticulously built over 3 decades with money, success, and denial, finally crumbled. He slumped into the executive chair behind him, buried his face in his hands, and cried. It wasn't a delicate cry. It was the kind of violent sobbing that comes when you finally stop running from something that has been chasing you your whole life. It was 30 years of loneliness, of emptiness, of searching for something you didn't even know what it was, all coming out at once. Clara didn't think. She simply moved, kneeling beside his chair, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder, the same gesture she made when he was 5 and woke up screaming from nightmares. It's okay, she murmured, exactly as she had decades ago. The monsters aren't real, Leo, and if they were, I would still fight them for you. Edward raised his head, his face wet with tears, his eyes red, completely stripped of any pretense of control. And then he said, in the broken voice of a 7-year-old boy trapped in a 37-year-old man's body, "You're my champion, Clara." And for the first time in 30 years, that secret code of childhood, those words that existed only between 2 orphans in a forgotten place, were spoken again. The circle was closing. The past was catching up to the present. But the story was far from over, because now came the hardest questions. What happened in the years they were separated? Why did Edward never look for her? And what the hell would they do with this impossible truth that had just exploded between them like a bomb? The vulnerability lasted for exactly 15 minutes, Edward composed himself with the brutal efficiency of someone trained never to show weakness. He wiped his face with a pocket square, straightened his tie, took 3 deep breaths, and when he looked at Clara again, the mask was back. Perhaps not as perfect as before, but firmly in place. "That was inappropriate," he said, his voice returning to its professional, cold tone. "I shouldn't have lost control like that." Clara was still kneeling beside his chair, but now she felt the distance like a physical blow. "Edward, there's nothing wrong with—" "There is," he cut her off, standing up abruptly and placing the desk between them as a barrier. "I have a company to run, investors to answer to, a reputation built on control and competence. I can't just break down because someone from my past showed up." "Someone from your past," Clara repeated, and there was pain in those words. "Is that how you're going to summarize what we were? What we still are?" "We are nothing," Edward said with a harshness that was clearly rehearsed. "We were 2 kids in a tough situation 30 years ago. That doesn't mean we have some mystical connection now. People move on, Miss Martinez. I moved on." Clara stood up slowly, her knees protesting. "Did you move on? Is that why you keep that portrait on the wall? Is that why you don't sleep well when it rains? Is that why you built a 12-bedroom mansion but live alone?" "You know nothing about my life," Edward retorted, but his eyes couldn't meet hers. "I know enough," Clara said gently without accusation, just sadness. "I know you're afraid. Afraid to remember. Afraid to feel. Afraid to admit that maybe all this success hasn't filled the hole that 7-year-old boy carries in his chest." Edward slammed his hand on the desk, making the pen holders jump. "Enough. You were hired to take care of my mother, not to psychoanalyze my life. If you can't maintain professional boundaries, I can easily find someone who—" "You had a scar," Clara interrupted him calmly, refusing to be intimidated. "On your right knee. Crescent moon shaped." Edward froze, his hand still in the air. "Show me," Clara challenged. "Prove I'm making it up. Prove I researched this somehow. Pull up your pant leg and show me that scar doesn't exist." The silence that followed was thick, suffocating. Edward glared at her, fighting a visible internal battle. Pride versus truth. Denial versus reality. Finally, with rigid movements, he crouched down, pulled the cuff of his right pants a few inches above his ankle, and there it was. A white, crescent-shaped scar, faded by time but still perfectly visible. 4 stitches, Clara said softly. "Dr. Patterson at the municipal emergency room. You squeezed my hand so hard I had purple marks for a week, and you didn't cry, not a single tear. You were so brave, Leo." Edward let go of his pants and stood up abruptly, turning his back to her. His shoulders were tense, trembling slightly. "That proves nothing. Only that you were there. It doesn't mean we need to relive this." "Why not?" Clara asked, and there was a growing frustration in her voice now. "Why is it so terrible to admit you had someone who loved you? That you were important to someone before all this money and power?" "Because it hurts," Edward exploded, spinning violently to face her. "Because remembering that place, that time, that pathetic scared child I was, makes me feel weak. And I can't be weak. Weakness doesn't build empires. Weakness doesn't earn respect. Weakness doesn't keep you safe," Clara finished, finally understanding. "You think if you allow yourself to feel, allow yourself to remember, you'll go back to being that vulnerable boy, and you never want to be vulnerable again." Edward didn't reply, but the truth was plastered across every tense line of his body. Clara took a step toward him, her voice softening. "But you're not that 7-year-old boy anymore, Edward. You're a 37-year-old man who built something incredible. Remembering where you came from won't erase that. It might even make it more meaningful. Or it could destroy everything," Edward whispered, and there was such genuine fear in his voice that Clara felt her heart clench. "How?" "Because if I admit that mattered, that you mattered, then I also have to admit that I abandoned you, Edward said, every word coming out like a confession forcibly torn from him. I was adopted by a wealthy family. I had everything: education, opportunities, love. And you stayed there, alone, until you were 18, and I never came back for you. So that was it. The guilt, the weight he carried without even consciously realizing it. You were 10 when you were adopted, Clara said firmly. A child. You had no control over any of that. But later, Edward argued, his voice breaking, at 15, at 20, at 30, I had resources. I could have hired investigators. I could have tried to find you. But I didn't try, because it was easier to just forget. Clara felt tears burn her eyes, but forced them back. And you think pushing me away now will fix that? You think pretending this never happened will ease that guilt? Edward didn't answer. He just looked at her with an expression so lost, so broken, that Clara saw clearly. He was terrified. Terrified of feeling. Terrified of remembering. Terrified of admitting that maybe, just maybe, he had spent 30 years running from the only person who truly knew him when he had no masks to wear. I need time, he finally said, his voice empty. I need to process all of this. Alone. Clara nodded slowly, acknowledging temporary defeat. All right, but Edward? She waited until he looked at her. You can build all the walls you want. You can push me away, fire me, pretend this never happened. But the truth won't disappear. It will stay here, waiting until you have the courage to face it. And with that, she left the office, leaving Edward Whitmore alone with his demons, his memories, and the question he could no longer avoid. Who was he really? The billionaire Edward who built an empire on forgetfulness, or the boy Leo who was still looking for the only person who made him feel like he was worth something? 2 days dragged on like years. Clara continued her work with Margaret, professional and silent, while Edward avoided her as if she were a contagious disease. He left before dawn, returned after midnight. His instructions came through cold emails sent by Jennifer. But on the morning of the 3rd day, Clara made a decision. She woke up at 5 in the morning in her tiny apartment, went to the dusty closet, and dragged out a worn cardboard box she hadn't opened in years. Inside, wrapped in yellowed plastic bags, were the only possessions she had kept from the orphanage, the things that were too valuable to throw away, but too painful to look at. With trembling hands, she found what she was looking for: a small, rusty metal box that was once a cookie tin. Inside, protected by thin plastic, was a piece of brown paper, carefully folded into 4 parts. Clara opened it with the delicacy of someone handling something sacred. The folds were worn, the paper stained by time, but the drawing was still visible. 2 stick figures holding hands made with faded green crayon, one larger, one smaller. Above them, in shaky, uneven, childish handwriting, Leo and Clara. Family forever, 1998. She flipped the paper. On the back, a crude map drawn with pencil, a square house with a rectangular door, 2 windows, a chimney spiraling smoke, a garden represented by green circles, and in the bottom corner, the 7-year-old script, Our house when we're big. Leo's promise. Clara held the paper against her chest, closing her eyes. She had carried this for 30 years, through temporary shelters, shared apartments, nights sleeping in her car. This paper had survived everything because it was physical proof that, at least once in her life, she had been important to someone. And now, it was time to return it to its true owner. At 8:15 in the morning, Clara entered the Whitmore mansion through the service entrance. Jennifer greeted her with her usual professionalism, making no mention of the obvious tension hanging over the house. "Mr. Whitmore is in the office," Jennifer said casually, but there was something in her tone. Curiosity, perhaps concern. He asked not to be disturbed, but "I need to talk to him," Clara interrupted, her voice firmer than she felt. "It's important." Jennifer studied her for a long moment, then nodded. 5 minutes. That's all I can give you." Clara walked down the familiar corridor to the office, the rusty metal box pressed against her chest like a shield. She knocked on the door, 3 soft but determined taps. "I said not to disturb me," came Edward's irritated voice from the other side. "It's Clara," she replied simply. Silence. Then, "Come in." She opened the door. Edward was sitting at his desk, surrounded by papers, 3 monitors alight showing graphs and spreadsheets. He didn't look up when she entered. "Is there a problem with Margaret?" "No, I have something for you." That made him finally look up. His eyes went straight to the box in her hands. "What is that?" Clara slowly approached, placing the box on the desk, between the expensive reports and the state-of-the-art laptop. "My only possessions from St. Mary's. The things I kept when I left at 18. Edward looked at the box as if it were a poisonous snake. "Clara, I already told you I need time." "And I respected that," she interrupted him. "But there's something here that belongs to you. It always has, and you deserve to have it back." She carefully opened the box. Inside were a few faded photographs, a worn cord with a St. Christopher medal, a small one-eyed teddy bear, and the brown paper, folded on top of everything. Clara picked it up, her hands trembling slightly, and placed it in front of Edward. "You gave me this the day before you were adopted. You said it was our promise, that no matter where you went, one day you would come back and we would have our house, our family." Edward stared at the paper as if seeing a ghost. His hands didn't move to pick it up. "Open it," Clara encouraged gently. "Please." After an eternity, Edward reached out. His fingers touched the paper with a reverent hesitation. He slowly unfolded it, and Clara saw the exact moment recognition hit. His eyes widened, his breath caught, his entire body froze. "My God," he whispered, his voice cracking. I remember drawing this." "You used the last piece of green crayon," Clara said softly. "You were so worried about making it perfect. You redid the hands 3 times until you were satisfied." Edward flipped the paper, seeing the map of the imaginary house. His fingers traced the faded pencil lines, and then he stopped at the signature. That's my handwriting. I recognize it. My L had that strange curve because I was still learning to write in cursive." "You made me promise to keep it," Clara continued, feeling tears sting her eyes. "You said, 'Keep this, Clara. When I come back, we're going to build this house for real.' And I kept it. For 30 years. Through everything. Because it was the only thing that proved you existed. That we existed." Edward couldn't take his eyes off the paper. His hands trembled holding it, and Clara saw a tear fall onto the paper, lightly staining the old ink. "I'm not crazy," Clara said, her voice firm despite the tears. "I didn't make anything up. I'm not trying to take advantage of you. This here is real, Edward. We were real. And you can build all the walls you want, but this piece of paper is the physical proof that there was a time when you loved me enough to promise me a family." Edward finally looked up, and what Clara saw there destroyed any remaining defenses. Absolute recognition, pain, regret, and something that looked dangerously like hope. "I came back," he said suddenly, his voice rough. I came back." Clara blinked, confused. "What?" "I came back," Edward repeated, louder now, almost desperate. "Not right away, but I came back. I swear I came back." And then he opened a locked desk drawer, pulled out an old folder, and threw photographs onto the table. Photographs of him younger, maybe early 20s, standing in front of the abandoned St. Mary's building. "I was 23, Edward said quickly, the words pouring out like a confession. "I had just sold my first company. I had money, resources, and the first thing I did was come back to look for you, Clara. The very first thing." Clara looked at the photographs, her heart pounding. But you didn't find me." "You were already gone," Edward said, and there was such deep anguish in his voice. 5 years earlier. The orphanage was closing. No one knew where you went. I hired investigators. I searched for 3 years. But Clara Martinez is a common name, and you left no traces. You just disappeared." Clara covered her mouth with her hands, the shock hitting her like a wave. He looked. He really looked. "I thought you forgot about me," Edward whispered, holding the drawing as if it were the most precious thing in the world. "I thought you had moved on, built a life, and I had no right to show up and mess everything up." "I never forgot," Clara wept. "Not a single day, not a single hour." And there, surrounded by physical proof of a past they both carried as open wounds, Edward and Clara finally understood the devastating truth. They never abandoned each other. Life simply tore them apart. And now, against all odds, it had brought them back together. Edward's revelation, that he had returned to St. Mary's Orphanage at age 23, wealthy and determined to find Clara, was not just a relief. It was an electric shock that rewrote 30 years of personal history for both of them. Clara was not the only one carrying the weight of loss. Edward had also lived with the pain of being forgotten by the only person who had loved him unconditionally. The guilt that had paralyzed him for years now transformed into a cold, focused urgency. He couldn't fix the past, but he could and must understand the failure of the search. That same afternoon, Edward Whitmore, the tech titan known for his calculated patience and disinterest in emotions, put his company on pause. He summoned Jennifer Crawford to the office and, ignoring his assistant's contained astonishment, gave her a single command. "Cancel everything. Find the best document and property tracing team on the West Coast. Tell them their job is to retrace my own investigation from 20 years ago. I want to know what went wrong. I want every scrap of paper, every property record, every employee name at St. Mary's Orphanage between 1998 and 2006. Don't worry about the cost. I want the answers by dawn." Clara was not fired. Edward, in a gesture that seemed completely out of his cold CEO character, placed her on indefinite paid leave, but at a higher salary. "You are not going anywhere," he said, his voice full of conviction. "You are my only witness. You are the only one who knows the truth, and I need you here when I find out mine." The next day was a storm of discreet activity at the mansion. Lawyers and investigators came in and out of the West Wing. Edward, in a worn hoodie and jeans, something Clara would never have imagined seeing him in, barely left the office. He was obsessed, sifting through maps, dusty documents, and microfilm transcripts from the time. Clara, now with free time, tried to process the tsunami of revelations by caring for Margaret, who, to her astonishment, began to react to the house's energy. "The boy?" Margaret murmured repeatedly, her unfocused eyes fixed on a point beyond the walls. "The boy who draws." Edward, in the middle of a video conference about tracking adoption records, heard Margaret's voice over the room intercom and rushed upstairs. "Mom? The boy? He's looking for the girl," Margaret said, gripping Clara's hand tightly. "Don't let him get lost." Edward stood in silence, absorbing the irony of that belated prophecy. His adoptive mother, in her demented state, was, somehow, accessing a truth that Edward had consciously denied for years. Progressing the investigation, Edward's team found the first hole. In 2001, St. Mary's Orphanage had attempted to get a license to become a community center, which required the transfer or disposal of all old records. Alameda County bureaucracy was notorious. Edward and the investigators found a trail of receipts from a document storage company that conveniently went bankrupt in 2007. "What's left?" Edward asked his lead investigator, a former FBI agent named Miller. "Only the structure, Mr. Whitmore. The building. It was condemned 10 years ago, but it's still standing. It's a shell. The rest was cleaned out or lost in unindexed digital files." Edward did not hesitate. He knew where he had to go. He grabbed the keys to his Tesla, a vehicle he rarely drove. "I'm going there. Now." Clara, sensing the urgency in the air, went up to him. I'm coming with you." He looked at her. Her eyes didn't ask permission. They demanded it. Edward nodded. "Get in." The drive to Oakland was silent, filled with the tension of someone preparing for an archaeological excavation into their own soul. They found St. Mary's in a desolate neighborhood on the verge of demolition. The red brick building was decaying, the windows broken, the wooden boards covering the doors looking like poorly made scars. The smell of mold, dust, and abandonment hung in the air. They climbed a barbed wire fence and entered what was once the entrance hall. It had the sinister echo of a place where much sadness had been stored. Edward turned on his cell phone flashlight. "The dormitory," Clara whispered, guiding him instinctively. "Where we slept. On the second floor." The staircase creaked under their weight. The dormitory was a cavernous space, with plaster falling from the ceiling and holes in the walls. The gray afternoon light streamed through the broken windows. Where the iron beds once stood lined up, there was now only rubble and trash. Edward moved methodically, almost ritually, touching the rough walls. "I remember this spot," he murmured, pointing to a dark discoloration near the floor. "This is where my bed was, the last one in the row, near the window." Clara knelt and ran her hand over the spot. "I slept right here. My bed was the second to last. I always left a space so you could crawl underneath if the thunder started." Edward gave a humorless laugh. Then he started searching. He examined the cracked plaster, the exposed bricks, the peeling paint. He was looking for something that a traumatized but hopeful child would leave behind. And he found it. Near the baseboard, on a part of the wall that demolition had exposed, was a thin layer of faded blue crayon, almost invisible under the dirt. Edward crouched, wiping it with his fingertips. Clara approached, and her heart stopped in her chest. The writing was shaky, but unmistakable, a child's handwriting learning to write in English. Leo was here. Leo came back for Clara, 1995, but no one was waiting. "It can't be." Clara gasped, the date hitting her. Edward read the inscription aloud, his voice strained. "I wrote that. I swear I wrote that. But the date, 1995, I was adopted in 98. I was 10. I didn't come back in 95. That's impossible." Confusion was a poison dripping in the air. Both were looking at undeniable physical proof that Edward had been there, heartbroken, 3 years before his adoption, promising to return for Clara. But how? He was just Leo, an orphan child without resources. He couldn't have left and returned. Clara looked at the floor, then at the rubble, searching for anything that made sense. And then she saw it. A folded corner of an old calendar, almost dissolved by moisture, caught under a loose board. She pulled it out. It was a calendar from 1995. "Edward, listen to me," Clara said, her voice urgent. "You couldn't have come back in 1995, but you might have tried to run away. You might have run out, gotten somewhere, and returned to the orphanage on your own before the adoption happened. And when you got back, you thought I was gone." Edward stood up, his eyes burning with a new terrible truth. "Run away. I tried to run away. I was 6 years old. I drew the map of our big house on the back of the drawing. I ran to find it, and I failed. But when I got back, I thought you were gone. And I wrote that." The final piece of the puzzle, however, came with an even darker revelation, found under a splinter of wood. It was a half-burnt log sheet, dated 1995, listing Leo W. as runaway 48 hours, and, most devastatingly, Clara M. exit records outdated, presumed transfer to St. Joseph's. Edward read aloud, his voice filled with horror. "Clara, they listed you as transferred to another orphanage in 1995, but you were here, the whole time. And when I came back at 6 years old, thinking I had failed to find you, I saw your exit records filled out. They made me think you were gone. They separated us on purpose. and I carried the weight of having abandoned you in 1998, when in fact the system had already lied to us in 1995. Edward's fear of being a coward who didn't search for Clara disintegrated, replaced by cold rage. His guilt had been a lie. The distance between them, a fraud. Someone, somewhere, had manipulated the records to keep Leo and Clara apart. But why? Edward clenched his fist around the piece of log sheet, his jaw locked. The billionaire Edward Whitmore was back, but this time driven not by profits or power, but by a righteous anger on behalf of two broken orphans. "We weren't abandoned," Edward whispered, looking at Clara. "We were robbed, and I'm going to find out who did this, and why." What he didn't know is that the answer to the why was buried even deeper, connected to his own past from 23 years ago. The ripped log sheet from 1995 was the fuse, but the failure of Edward's search years later was the true wound. Billionaire Edward Whitmore had returned at 23, with all the resources, and yet failed to find a single girl in the system. He was determined to expose the fraud that had separated them. Cold rage drove him. Back at the mansion, Edward and Clara pored over the documents found by investigator Miller. The name of St. Mary's head supervisor at the time of Edward's adoption, 1998, and the search, 2001, was a Mrs. Mildred Henderson. Clara remembered her as cold as ice. Edward then confronted Miller, the former FBI agent. "I tasked you with retracing my own search. What happened when I first hired investigators in 2001? Miller hesitated. "Mr. Whitmore, what we found is delicate. There's a paper trail indicating that in 2001, when you searched for Clara Martinez, Mrs. Henderson provided your investigators with deliberately incomplete information. She said that Clara left at 18 and did not want to be contacted, and that she had issues to discourage you from continuing." "Why?" Edward hissed. Miller placed a folder on the table. "We found St. Mary's payroll records. Mrs. Henderson was on the payroll until 2003, but she received a substantial extra payment in 2001, shortly after your search, an amount that corresponds to 3 years of her salary." Clara, who was standing nearby, gasped. "She was paid to keep me out of your way." "Yes, but by whom?" Edward questioned, his CEO mind working at maximum speed. "An orphanage employee doesn't have that kind of money. Who else would have an interest in ensuring that Edward Whitmore never found the orphanage girl?" Edward closed his eyes. The answer could only be in his own universe. His adoptive father, Richard Whitmore, was a financial magnate, obsessed with the image of perfect, immaculate success. Edward, the adopted prodigy, was the crown jewel. The presence of a home health aide, a humble, non-adopted employee from his past, could have been seen as a blemish, a threat to his status. Edward remembered a cold conversation he had with Richard in 2001, shortly after his first search attempt. "The past is dead weight, Edward. Get rid of it. There's no room for sentimentality in a Whitmore's life. That Clara Martinez is a ghost you must exorcise, not resurrect." The realization hit with overwhelming weight. Richard Whitmore, his adoptive father, the man who had rescued him from poverty, and given him his new name and empire, was also the man who ensured he would never find his true family. Not out of hatred, but out of a selfish, possessive love for his image. Richard's money silenced Mildred Henderson, ensuring the orphanage ghost remained buried. Edward picked up the framed photograph of Richard Whitmore that was on the shelf. His lips trembled. He had admired Richard's calculated coolness. Now he despised it. The man who taught him to build an empire was the same man who destroyed the only chance to fill the emptiness the empire had created. "He didn't want me to be vulnerable," Edward whispered, his voice hoarse. "He feared that the connection to you would make me weak. He stole the one thing that would make me feel human." Clara approached, seeing the pain of betrayal. "He acted out of fear, Edward. Fear of losing you. But he was wrong. He taught you to build gold. but he denied you the warmth of a home. The moment was Edward's true liberation. He saw himself free from the obligation of being Richard's perfect Edward Whitmore. The guilt of not having searched for Clara turned into righteous anger against his father's lie, and Clara's fear of having ruined his life turned into deep compassion. "We were both victims," Edward said, finally looking at Clara with clarity. "We were robbed of our home, but the difference is that I have the power now, and I will not accept this." His success, his wealth, the Whitmore empire, everything Richard built to keep them apart, would now become the tool to unite them. Edward picked up the crumpled drawing of Leo and Clara from the metal box. It was no longer proof, it was a manifesto. He knew exactly what he would do next. It wasn't about financial compensation, it was about rewriting the end of the orphanage story. The foundation of his new life would not be built on ashes, but on Leo's childish promise. The revelation about Richard Whitmore acted as a catalyst, clearing the path for Edward and Clara. There was no more guilt, only the urgency to mend what was broken. Edward's first step was not financial, but familial. He summoned Clara back to the office, not as CEO and employee, but as the older brother she never knew she had become. He placed the castle drawing on the desk and pointed to the two stick figures. "The promise," Edward said, his voice calm and firm. "It took 30 years, but we're going to build it." Clara expected a large check for Marcus's surgery, or perhaps a partnership offer in the company. What came was deeper. "I robbed you of a home and a family for over 2 decades, Edward continued. "No money can pay for that, but what I can give you is my name, again. Not as an employee, but as a sister. I have listed you as the main beneficiary of my will, alongside Margaret. It's not out of obligation, it's by right. You are the only family that saw me when I was Leo." Clara was speechless, tears returning. "Edward, I can't accept this. I'm your mother's caregiver, and Marcus's surgery is paid for." Edward interrupted her, extending his hand to her, a gesture that was more a brother's handshake than a boss's. "The money is in the hospital account. And Margaret, she calms down with you. You remind her of something good, and I won't send you away. But your role has changed. You are no longer my HHA. You are the only person who can enter the east wing of the mansion and call me Leo when I need it. And I will be the Uncle Marcus never had, ever." The mansion, which was once a cold fortress of loneliness, began to transform. Clara and Marcus moved into a spacious suite in the east wing, close to Margaret's room. For the first time, Clara had peace, and Marcus had a healthy future and a new mentor, a billionaire uncle who taught him about stars and technology, and who, in turn, laughed at the boys' silly jokes. But Edward didn't stop there. His investigation had revealed the fragility of the foster care system. Leo's promise to have a home needed to extend to other children. "We're going to build the castle, Clara," he said a month later in the garden. "Not one for us, but one for all the Leos and Claras who are being separated by bureaucracy and greed." In 6 months, Edward and Clara launched the St. Mary's Children Foundation. Edward donated a significant portion of his personal fortune and used his network in the technology industry to create a system for tracing adopted children and biological relative families, ensuring that no child was lost in the system again. Clara, now the Foundation's executive director, was the moral compass of the Whitmore empire. She brought the raw honesty and vulnerability that the channel needed. She used her own trauma as fuel for change. The Whitmore Mansion ceased to be a monument to cold success. It hosted foundation meetings, charity events, and, most importantly, laughter. Edward discovered that true innovation was not creating the next billionaire app, but mending broken hearts. Success was not what he had, but who he had by his side. The story ends in the garden. Marcus, now recovered, runs across the manicured lawn. Clara and Edward, both in their 40s, are sitting on a stone bench watching the sunset. "He made it," Edward whispered, looking at Marcus. "His little champion is the proof." Clara smiled, leaning her head on his shoulder. "We made it, Edward. We built the house." It wasn't the Crayon Castle, but it was the home they had promised each other 30 years ago. Not a physical place, but a space of love, acceptance, and unconditional family. The silence was peaceful, the kind of peace that only comes after the most painful truth is revealed, processed, and used to create something beautiful. Edward Whitmore had finally found his place. Not as the Wall Street prodigy, but as Clara's older brother and Marcus's uncle. And the empty mansion was, finally, full.